Welcome to the sixth podcast on a series of discussions with different people surrounding the studio on sustaining the craft of acting. I have two people here that I work with very closely, or rather my students do. One is Phil Hall, a New York City vocal coach who, I'll just say this, he would never say this. My students always smile when they come in from working with him. I'm not sure they always smile when they leave from working with me. And and the progression in some of them is transformational and very much in line with the process that goes on here. And Tom Vasiliades is the director of the American Center, Alexander Center for
Performance and Development.
And Tom and I have been working together for well over 20 years, probably close to 23, 24, and go back a long way. And I'm a big believer in the process that he teaches welding the voice and the rest of the actor's instrument together in a very centered way. And I think what we're going to talk about is the importance they're going to talk about of the real actor being trained, I believe should be trained 10 times more fully in their external processes of the craft of acting than the false actor who simply relies upon them to create an effect, so that when they are actually developing the role, the voice, movement, and other aspects of that come directly through the reality of the characterization, through the reality of what the playwright wrote. So they're nodding their heads. So we know we're all on the same page with that. So do you want to start first about the voice and the importance of that?
Yeah, I think the main thing about, I actually went through school majoring in undergraduate school as a singer and in graduate school as a singer, but I've always had strong musical abilities. And very often when I was young, I was putting together musical reviews. I was playing for people to sing. So for a long time, I sort of sat on the fence of two worlds. I sort of musical directed, and I also performed I got my degrees in performing. But one thing I knew the whole time I was studying, and I'm reminded of it every day of my life, is that an actor's voice is his instrument or her instrument. Mm-hmm. And I have to say that though I'm from North Carolina, and I had not, until I came to New York City, had I taken in sort of where the greatest actors can gather to do their things, and I was able to go see some of them do it. I have to say that I've always been impressed by when I see people in movies or TV productions, but very often it was English actors at the time before I moved here who I thought, wow, their speaking voices are so beautifully trained. They're strong when they need to be, but their diction is impeccable, but their ability to project their speaking voice. Now, oftentimes singers, certainly learn to project their singing voices. But in the acting world, it's a different thing. And one of the most telling things to me, or one place where I learned so much, is Tony Randall years ago had the National Actors Theater, I believe he started. Correct. And I thought that was a wonderful idea because he loved theater and he wanted to make that happen. So I subscribed, and I was excited because he was bringing all his film friends to New York to do, starting with The Crucible with Martin Sheen. And I went to see it, and Martin Sheen was completely laryngitic. I mean, you couldn't hear what he said because he had total laryngitis. And then I saw another stage actor in another thing who had no voice. You could not hear them on the stage. And then I realized that I just assumed that when an actor, no matter what field they were in or how they had studied, that their speaking voice was well suited to the stage. And then another prime example is who was the lady who won for Driving Miss Daisy? Jessica Tandy. Mm-hmm. When she won her Academy Award, oh my gosh, her voice booming out. as she accepted her Academy Award. The placement of her voice was so magnificent. And, it was so clear to me that certain people had trained their voices for acting on a stage versus doing movies. I don't know if the people who I saw who had voice projection problems, perhaps they had been trained, and then they maybe got into the film and TV world where the cameras are so close to them they want them to speak like they're talking like that. Or if they had gotten lazy because that had happened, but they were originally trained well with their voice. It's hard for me to know because I didn't know the people's background, but I learned so much about a person's instrument. And without your instrument, really there's so little that you can do. Your instrument is such an intrinsic part because it is the verbal expression of your thought of who you are inside and what you bring forth when you get on the stage.
So I'm going to comment on this a little
Please.
because the Salvini, the great 19th century Othello, said, "Voice, e voice, e voice." And I said once in an interview that every actor or actress should have the voice of a Sutherland or Corelli, right?
That's pretty good.
Move like Nureyev or Maya Plisitskaya, and of course act like Oscar Werner, Brando, or Arletty, the great French actress. Now, all those actors spent hours of time on their vocal instruments. And the myth about Brando, because for certain roles he did certain things in film, he worked every day on his voice. Okay? So it's part of an actor's discipline for life. You either subscribe to the magazine for life or don't do it. At least we're of that school.
Right.
And that sort of passion, it's funny, I'm rereading Graham Greene. And in this one place, he said, a vocation is not a professional career.
Interesting. True.
And once you lose the desire, you're no longer in love. And so for an actor, in the way that finally they think of the voice, but what you're saying is absolutely correct. It has to be placed in tune with the actor's emotional instincts so that it
is the expression of that person and of the words they've been given to portray, in the roles they're playing. But I feel like it's the instrument. Without their instrument, they really have nothing.
And the odd thing, excuse me, Tom. The odd thing here, I just want to comment on one of the actors you mentioned. He's of a school of thought that has to do with negating part of that instrument for the sake of truth, which is more for the sake of indulgence. And it's strictly indulgent. Not that I have any great love of the British actor overall. I don't. Mm-hmm. I do not. Mm-hmm. The great actors to me were the Germans and the Russians. So the guy I really want to hear from, something I've seen the difference in my students. Michael Griffiths was one of them. How he went from being a professional type athlete to this flowing, dancing like instrument. But few people know much about Alexander and its purpose for the actor. And I wish you'd.
Well, I would say I think there are people do know about it, mm-hmm. But there are a lot of misunderstandings.
That's a better way of putting it.
And I would say, just to build off of what Phil was saying, and also to sort of just go back a little bit further, I sort of want to, I don't mean this argumentatively at all, but I think the languaging of things as externals in terms of the actor is problematic. And why I mean that, where I'm coming from an Alexander perspective, and maybe there's others that would agree, that we are a psychophysical unity.
Mm-hmm.
And from that vantage point, there is no internal and there is no external.
Correct.
It's the person. So jumping off from that and what Phil was talking about, the voice, the Alexander technique came out of Frederick Matthias Alexander, who was an actor in Australia in the late 1800s, who lost his voice while reciting Shakespeare's soliloquies and poetry. And he went to doctors and he asked them, when I've lost my voice, of course, obviously that's an awful thing if you're a performer. And they said, well, do some vocal rest for a couple of weeks and you should be okay. And he had an engagement coming up that was important to him. And 2 weeks passed and he followed everything to the letter of the treatment, everything. He went out. In the middle of that performance, 2 weeks later, he again felt hoarseness and lost his voice. So he went to doctors and back to the doctors and said, well, what's going on? Why have I lost my voice? And they couldn't help him, or they couldn't tell him, except continue doing what we said to do that didn't help you for your last performance. So he decided to figure it out for himself. And he went through a process of observing himself in mirrors, becoming aware that what he was doing to himself when he was speaking was stiffening his neck, pulling his head back and down, shortening his spine, shortening and narrowing his back, pulling his legs and arms into his torso, and that he didn't know that he was doing that until he saw that in the mirror. So his awareness of himself was unreliable, and that he was then able to, with his thinking, prevent himself from doing that habit and pattern that he had developed, and to transform that. And through that process was able to, if you will, cure himself of his vocal problems. And that's really what the work is based on. The work is based on not having or not going with your subconscious habitual reaction to something, but rather being aware in a psychophysical sense, psychophysical unity sense, what you're doing, is that what you want to be doing? And to become so skillfully aware of yourself, so reliably aware of yourself, that you won't negatively interfere with your use and functioning. And what I mean by use and functioning, in a general human way, with your respiration, circulation, digestion, but now taking that into acting, well, if you're misusing yourself, if you're stiffening your neck, if you're bracing in your ribs, you're not going to breathe well. Well, we all know what that's going to do to your vocal production. Mm-hmm. It's going to completely screw it up. So if you can use yourself better from an Alexander vantage point, and the primary criterion is the organization of the head, neck, and back to the limbs. If you can organize that yourself well, that underlying pattern, then anything that you do will come out okay, including the sound that you make. And so people that I've worked with vocal problems or not, their voice improves. They have a fuller, more resonant, clearer, open sound, more expressive for acting in terms of physicality. They were able to create the physical life of a role, if you will, with greater ease. They have greater emotional availability and expression.
Of course.
But it comes from this underlying use of oneself. And if you're misusing yourself, you won't function as well.
Mm-hmm. So let me, it's pretty clear. So the one thing we all agree on, that none of it is separate.
Yes.
None of it is separate. That it's one thing as a whole, mm-hmm. and must emanate as such. Mm-hmm. We may use different terminology from the craft we teach, right. But we're saying the same thing.
Yes.
Okay? So, aside from a malaise of, we're living in a time where people, especially in the theater, actors, do not necessarily think they have to be trained. We're in the age of personality instead of the age of. I remember a woman came down here several years ago. It must have been 15 years ago. And she said, I want to thank you for restoring this art. And I said, thank you. I didn't know what to say. But there's some truth to that people doing this on this level are rare. Now, I don't know if you find this, but the younger people, the so-called millennials, I don't pay attention to those labels, they have a real interest in craftsmanship. I don't know if you find that to be so. But the ones that do, that interest is genuine. That would be how I'd put it. It's truly genuine. In fact, I sent someone to you who couldn't continue right now because of what he's doing. Mm-hmm. But his interest is genuine. Mm-hmm. And they don't come out of the basis of exposure as a person of the theater that we did, And do you suffer from the frustrations of that at all in your work?
Well, I would say it's not what you're describing. It's not limited to the theater, obviously.
It's not. But that's what we're talking about.
It's a cultural thing, and so I think that there are people who are interested in what we're talking about here. But just sort of a general comment is that people want an app.
There you go.
For the Alexander technique sometimes. Not all the time, but sometimes. And is it any more or less, if you go back 40 years, is it any more or less? I don't know. I can't say one way or the other. Have people always wanted to shortcut? Have they? I guess so. Is that happening more now than before? I don't know. I can't say for sure. But how I would characterize it, using some current day language, is that people want an app. That's what they want.
That's correct.
And it doesn't work that way.
Well, and I'd like to hear your view on this, but that is because people that emanate, well, I guess I emanate from a different generation even than you two, but certainly you do as well, understand that there's a price to be paid for skill. And this generation has grown up in a society of convenience and expedient. They're not concerned with how they take the trip. There's a phrase I use. From an actor's point of view, it's not the end of the trip that matters. It's the trip along the way. Mm-hmm. And they're not concerned of how they get to London. They're concerned that they leave and they get to London. Mm-hmm. And it's problematic. It's problematic. 4 scales and let's do, Louisa Miller. I'm kidding around. And I don't mean it as being insulting. I think these young people are victimized by this monolith of technology, but eventually every bubble bursts, So I'd like to hear what you have to say about it. I usually want to hear what you have to say.
Well, I think that, the other thing I wanted to ask you is you said the relationship of the neck and spine to the limbs. Talk about that a little bit more, because I don't know the Alexander technique as well as you do, certainly from the inside out.
Yeah. Well, it's that the postural support structure is the torso, the neck, and the head. And if you can get that postural support happening in a way which the musculature is elastically spreading through the head, neck, and back, out through to the limbs, that's what you want to have. Whether you're sitting, standing, walking, talking, lifting things, carrying things, whatever it is that you're doing, as opposed to having it in such a way where you're either rigidly holding yourself up, and you see what that does to my head, neck, and back, and to my limbs, or that I'm collapsed down and I'm relaxed, hanging out. What that does to that relationship, that organization, or if I'm sort of really actively, really interested in what I'm saying and doing, and I'm pulling everything down and in. That's what it's hard. You can't see that on.
Same thing will happen when you act.
Right.
The same thing will happen. All of this is eventually to become reflexive in the instrument, but it doesn't become reflexive without laying a foundation. So go ahead.
Well, I think that, when I was coming up at Chapel Hill, and I went to UNC at Chapel Hill and to Indiana University, and I never even heard of the Alexander technique during those years that I was in both places. I'd never heard of it, and I think it had probably been around. I was in school in 70 to 74. And so I think that it's unfortunate that there is no immersive organization where all this stuff is made available to the students when they go to a place. I do think I have found, as you say, that it's very result oriented. Everything is result oriented. And these, when you have a master class of where you bring some young singers together, like children who are interested in theater, they want to come away with 2 16-bar cuts that they're ready to perform in 48 hours. There's something to be said for that, because they can get up and utter something out of that they know, that they're not learning brand new. But the whole process of that, there's no process.
I would say that in terms of the technique, Alexander started teaching the work in 1894, and he moved to London in 1904 and lived there until he passed away in 1955. In the early 1930s, he began to formally train people to teach the work, and those people trained other people, and so on. Some of that first class, there were some Americans that have somehow found out about his work, because in the teens and the 20s, he would come here to New York and also to New England to give lessons and so on. And I guess people heard about him and so on and so forth. And he wrote a few books, 4 books actually. 5, but then it became 4. Anyway, he, in teaching those people, and then people branched out, they came back to the States and so on and so forth. And it really wasn't until those teachers, some of so-called first-generation teachers, people who were trained by him, or second-generation teachers who were trained by people who were trained by Alexander, until they began to go out in the world a bit more, that the technique, at least here in the States, began to get affiliated or brought into performing arts schools.
Right.
Like at Juilliard, Julie Leibowitz was someone who started the Alexander program at Juilliard, and it's still there, and other people as well. But the problem is, if you go to an institution, they say, "Oh, great, Alexander technique. Love for you to teach the Alexander technique. Okay, we want to put 16 people in a class." And I've done that. I've done that at NYU, at the New School. I also teach a class in the evening division at Juilliard. This is very much a one-on-one work.
Yes.
Because, the 3 of us are here. We're different shapes and sizes.
Right.
There are different things going on. We've had different experiences. Our use, to use some Alexander jargon, is different. And to help each person become aware of what that individual subconscious pattern and habit is, it's going to take some individual time.
Yes.
Instead of, we're in a class of 16 people. You're doing this, you're doing that, you're doing that. If you just divide the time allotted by 16, you get
not
3 minutes.
Time. Yeah.
Well, there was, let me interrupt, because I want to bring this back to acting, even though it's not going away from acting. That's why this circle that we've been talking about for so long is so important because it gives the individual attention within the ensemble mentality, all circling around this. Acting is an ensemble craft. When I look in the paper and see we've gone from the vagina monologues to how Tommy lost his soul and this is my story, that's not really a genuine theatrical experience. I didn't say it wasn't valid. I'm saying it's not a genuine theatrical experience. Is an ensemble experience. It simply is. The problem is, Tom, is that it's institutionalized. Now, the very best acting school for a long, long time was the neighborhood playhouse school of the theater. You had Sanford Meisner, Martha Graham, Pearl Lang, the greatest speech teacher who ever lived, Robert Williams. This guy was just amazing. Rod Colvin taught fencing. Royal Hinman, do you ever hear that? He was the kapellmaster for the Met. And you went every day from 9 to 6, and most of us had to go work terrible jobs. Meisner made sure we had scholarships so we could get through, those of us that didn't have any money. But it was still an institution. Right. Even though the classes reduced themselves, the more advanced, but you had an assistant. Well, in my case, I worked for a while with Wynn Hannon, who was really a Meisner teacher. And then it went to other teachers. But now you run it, well, I studied Meisner, or I studied Adler, or I studied Strasberg. Where? In Four Forks, Sioux City, Iowa. When did they study with Meisner? And my answer always is one, there was one Meisner, and if you studied with him, you studied with Meisner. There's one Phil Hall. It fits into his theory of use. There's one Tom Vasiliades, and there's what I never refer to myself as a Meisner teacher, and no one's more grateful for having been with those teachers. Mm-hmm. Or Matt Maddox, also the great jazz teacher. But had that work stayed in one place, if the work stays in one place, there's no growth, there's no continuity, there's no real process.
Right.
As you know, Martinelli did not sing the same way that Placido Domingo did in his prime.
Right.
It grew. And real teachers convey that from their understanding of what they've developed, which are the teachers I try to pick. Mm-hmm. And it's a dilemma in this particular era, because what this does is removes any need to put forth this. So when I listened to Tom and I listened to you, and I was somewhere last night where I said, well, I've been married to my work for 45 years. It's simply the truth. It's true. And how do you do you enjoy the people you work with? Not from here necessarily.
Yes, I feel like every person who I meet, there's a reason that neither of us may ever know why our paths have intersected. Mm-hmm. They may meet for one time. They may be flying in to get ready for an audition for something. They have an imminent audition already scheduled, and that's the reason they're here. That may be the only time I see them. But yes, I feel like we cross people's paths for a reason, and I enjoy every single one of them. I like that they are, what they can do and can't do is varied, so that it's not always the same thing. I do explain to them that learning how to sing, though, really ultimately falls back to a classical singing technique. I don't care what kind of singing, even if you sing like Sarah Bareilles or you sing like a pop singer or a rap singer or whatever. A lot of people will come to study voice when they are wearying their voice in what they're doing. And they don't know, they've never learned the classical side of it. And that's okay that I think it's wonderful if they're out able to do what they're doing and it gives them joy and they're making a living at it, or it gives them joy whether it's an avocation. But ultimately, people will contact voice teachers and say, I represent so and so, and she's getting tired when she sings, and she needs to come have some lessons because her voice is getting fatigued. So then you have to see what they're presenting when they come in, sort of what they know and how they sing. And I usually ask them to do something they already know that they have in their voice, so we can have a starting off place. So I can just hear that, and then I will usually talk to them a little bit and we'll vocalize. But I feel like you have to introduce them really to the nuts and bolts of their instrument and to the classical sort of singing techniques that have so much to do with the projection of your voice, whether you're singing or whether you're speaking. When I was at IU, I had a teacher his name was Gene Dice. Unfortunately, he was a New York City opera tenor, and he had a tongue cancer and had to have half his tongue removed and had to have chemotherapy to get well. So he had a slight speech impediment, but he would sit over in the corner of my lesson room. It was maybe about the size of the room we're in right now. And he would just go, hey! And he would do that time after time. And I tried to do it, and I couldn't understand I tried to mimic him because I think mimicry goes a long way. But it took me a long time before I understood. He kept saying, and as I've heard other people like Renee Fleming talk about singing being a controlled scream when you are singing classically because of the amount of sound that's pouring out of the singer. But finally, eventually I understood that. And when I did, I think a lot of perhaps my body then conspired to make that sound. Whereas before that time, I had no idea how in the world one might make that sound. And yet he did it every lesson for as many years as I was there, trying to impart that wisdom to me. And I could try to mimic it, but my throat wasn't open. And until I learned how to open my throat, and then that was really a revelation to me. Mm-hmm. And I think it is to everybody. I've had girls sometimes that they're singing that when their throat finally opens, they start crying spontaneously. Tears shoot out of their eyes, and they can't control their emotions because somehow magically the throat, which is often where people will hold emotion, has been freed. And in that, I don't know, it's like an epiphany, an emotional epiphany for them. But I have to say, it's been amazing. It's happened twice in my whole lifetime of working with people. That girls were singing, they just tears, they start crying, and they can't stop crying because their throat is open finally. And they're getting the sense of what that feels like to open that up. And it's really life-changing, I have to say.
What would you say is the big obstacle to teaching any sense of craft? Because craft emanates from instinct. I could go and learn how to be a trampoline artist all I want, but I have no instinct from it. I never like to leave the ground, So what would you say is your biggest obstacle, and I'll come back to you, as a teacher in today's world versus a time when you were beginning in this profession?
I don't know if there's a different obstacle necessarily, because in terms of the Alexander work, mm-hmm. because what I'm doing is not teaching somebody to bounce on the trampoline. I'm not teaching someone to hammer a nail or anything like that. What I'm teaching the person is to become more reliably aware of themselves so that they can stop doing the things that aren't good for them and do the things that are good for them. Now, the things that I think are problematic, I think are same thing maybe 50 years ago, 100 years ago, whatever. That is people want to get it right. People are afraid of being wrong, and so on and so forth.
I think that's the problem.
There's those kinds of things that come up. Or, I know how this should work, even though they've never taken any Alexander before.
Mm-hmm.
And so on. So part of it has to do with one's, if you will, individual attitude about life, really, about what they do and who they are. And while people come to me for all sorts of things, not only performing artists, people with chronic pain, people with respiratory issues, people looking for sort of individual growth and development, but talking about performers, let's leave it in that, talking about those folks.
Well, that's what we're...
Yeah, so it's that they come face to face with how they approach things, and how they approach things gets in the way of them growing and developing with the work.
So
I would just say, I don't know if that's a difference. It might be a difference given that 40, 50 years have gone by, since 40 years actually, since I started training as an actor. There might be some differences, but by and large, people want to be right. They don't want to be wrong. There's fear, there's concern, there's a cockiness. I know how things are. All those kinds of things that I think are what humans do. And it gets in the way of them learning that work, meaning the Alexander work. But I think that's true with singing, that's true with the work that you do, Bob, and true with kind of probably learning mathematics.
Well, you can see that I don't quite agree with you. I mostly agree with you. It's getting it right, fear of failure. You're not going to go very far in the arts if you're afraid to fail. I mean, along with everything else that made Brando so extraordinarily, is he could have cared less about failing. Or, frankly, Pavarotti. He may not have been as technically as strong a singer as, but he could have cared less. Correct?
Well, I think it was interesting. He gave Joan Sutherland, who sort of mentored him, a lot of credit for teaching him how to sing as well as he did. He said that she taught him how to breathe better than he had ever breathed before. Oh my gosh, when Joan Sutherland passed, they did at Town Hall a retrospective of her career with many people showing up who were still living, who had worked with her. And they showed an old tape of Pavarotti and Joan Sutherland singing Sulla Tomba in a rehearsal that just made your hair stand on end. It was so brilliant. Yeah. They were both so young and so fearless, it seemed. He just dug into what he was doing. I think for me, the key is really the ideal scenario is where there's a fearlessness. Like you said, but if people just welcome, okay, I'm here to learn, and I'm going to let myself be open to what this is and see where it takes me. And then when they do, I find those people move along so much faster because they don't mind in front of me. I try to create an atmosphere with the student one-on-one that they can trust me that it's a safe atmosphere. But then I encourage that fearlessness. And I have to say that when I've come to, like when you had your graduation exercise, I was blown away by the scenes that they did. And I don't know drama as well as I know music. But still, the scenes were intense, and they had so many there's so much dynamism to the shape of it. And watching the actors do that was amazing to me, because that in 20-minute scene, it felt like I had seen a full opera.
Yeah.
That's what it feels like.
Well, that's what it should seem like.
Exactly.
That's what it should. I was very fortunate. The first night I came to New York to study acting, a long time ago, more than 40 years, I had time, and I went to a play with a friend of mine. And I went to see High Spirits. It was the only thing we could get tickets for. And I was just enthralled with Tammy Grimes. Not because she was that great or anything. It was because she was that fearless.
Yes.
So for me, underneath the fearlessness is a passion and an instinctual romance for what you do without being romantic about it. You've got to be a hardcore practitioner.
Right.
Michelangelo did not paint or sculpt that volume of work by being a sentimentalist. You know, that's not what I'm saying. And that passion in today's theater world, especially, is disappearing. I teach a young man now who both of you know. I want it all. You know, he wants it all, and it's obvious every time. You know, and that fear of being, that need to be right gives you one other option. And Conrad said, art is long and life is short, and success is very far off. Success isn't part of it, you know. It's just not part of it in the terms that we've been taught success means. And that's been reinvented and then multiplied 10 times over. You know,
I just to add, or maybe put it another way, just think about fearless and getting it right and not wanting to get wrong and all that. What we're doing, it seems to me, is, in part, a way to look at it is that these people who are studying with us, they're going from the known to the unknown.
mm-hmm.
And how you respond to that, how you react to that,
Mm-hmm.
Is very important.
It's very important.
Very important.
And so the part of the fearlessness, as I understand it, or as I think of it, is not simply, oh, I'm going to jump off the 6-story window without a parachute and with no mat on the bottom. It's not that. It's this fearlessness that I'm going to go from what I know to what I don't know.
Every day.
All the time. In this way, and my reaction to that is going to be accepting of that, is to going to embrace that.
Right.
That's what I think is really what you need to have.
Right.
And those who come with it, and part of it, as a teacher, is supporting someone in that journey as they come up against that, and as it is hard for them, to support them in that journey, to guide them through that. That's very gratifying. Yes. And I don't ever tire of that. In fact, I am passionate about that. Mm-hmm. It's really a great joy.
Sort of feeds your soul, doesn't it?
Yes, and with that, I never get bored.
Mm-hmm. So when I'm teaching, and I think that we all agree upon, one way to put it is, people say, well, what keeps you going? And then there was 10 years before, so we're talking about a long time. Mm-hmm. I said, when I see someone walk out of here, when they've completed this and they no longer need a teacher, mm-hmm. they no longer need someone to take them through the process. Mm-hmm. That's the gratification. Mm-hmm. Your work is done.
I try to empower them to be in charge of their own vocal destiny, ultimately. If they want to drop in occasionally to learn some music or to check in, Leontine Price had a long time accompanist David Garvey mm-hmm. after her voice teacher had passed away and was not available to her. And she, who was out doing these opera roles, but still kept her voice in amazing shape, but she would check in with him. She would go to sing with him, and if he had anything to say, he would tell it to her, and she trusted him. And I think that that's what a teacher does. A teacher, first off, I think that years ago when I decided to go into therapy, several people had sent me their places they went to for therapy, and I went to 7 different places and got assigned a therapist. And I said to them when I was assigned, I said, "Are you the person that I'll work with if I stay here?" And they said yes. And I said, "Well, I'm just not coming back because I don't feel any simpatico with you. I don't feel like..." And the last person that I finally found, and I told him, I said, "I am committed to this. I want to do this work, and I'm going to trust you until you give me a reason not to. And I can't even imagine that you will because of my sense of you. but I'm going to trust you because now I have work to do, and let's go. And I think that's sort of the environment that I knowing you as a person, I just think that's exactly what they get from you. And knowing what you're going to impart to them as an acting teacher, I think that they trust that they will get what they have sought out from you.
And more.
Yes.
And more. It's that unknown. So I want to thank you both for doing this. We did 45 minutes without blinking.
Oh, that was great.
Wow.
I surely enjoy hearing about your stuff. I loved your vantage points and things I don't know about.
Likewise. Yes, thank you.
So, thank you.
Great.
My pleasure.
They went by quickly.